October 13th, 1923, Chicago's South Side. A 24-year-old Al Capone stands at the corner of Halsted and Taylor, staring down a street that everyone in the neighborhood knows belongs to his enemies. At the end of that street, in a warehouse controlled by the Torrio gang's biggest rivals, his older brother Frank is being held, beaten, bloodied, and probably hours away from death. The message had been simple: come alone or your brother dies. It was a trap. Everyone knew it was a trap. Even Frank, wherever he was, knew it was a trap. But Al Capone, still young enough to believe that courage could overcome any odds, still Italian enough to know that family comes before everything else, still foolish enough to think he was invincible, began walking down that street. What happened in the next hour would become legend on Chicago's South Side. Not because it was reported in newspapers, this was the kind of business that stayed in the shadows, but because it was the kind of story that men told their sons, and those sons told their sons, about what it meant to be a brother, about what it meant to risk everything for family. This is the story of the night Al Capone learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the only thing worth doing. To understand what happened that October night, you have to understand Chicago in 1923. Prohibition was 3 years old, and the city had become a battlefield, not just between law enforcement and bootleggers, but between the bootleggers themselves, fighting over territory, shipments, and the enormous profits that came with controlling the flow of illegal alcohol. Al Capone, still in his early 20s, was working as a lieutenant for Johnny Torrio, the man who had brought him from New York to Chicago to help organize their growing operation. Al was smart, loyal, and completely fearless, exactly the kind of man Torrio needed as competition grew more violent. But Al wasn't the only Capone brother in Chicago. Frank, 3 years older, had followed Al to the city and had quickly established himself as someone to be respected. Frank was quieter than Al, more diplomatic, but just as tough when the situation required it. The brothers worked different territories, but they stayed close. Sunday dinners at their mother's house when she visited. Late-night conversations about business and family, the kind of bond that forms between brothers who have watched out for each other since childhood. On October 12th, Frank was supposed to meet with some independent operators who wanted to discuss working with the Torrio organization. It was routine business, the kind of meeting that happened every week as their empire expanded. Frank never came home. When Al went looking for his brother the next morning, what he found made his blood run cold. Frank's car, abandoned in an alley near the meeting location. The driver's side window shattered, blood on the seat, and pinned to the steering wheel, a note written in crude handwriting: "We got your brother, warehouse on Carpenter Street. Come alone by midnight, or fish him out of the river tomorrow." It was signed with the mark of the Jenna brothers, Sicilian immigrants who controlled a chunk of the South Side and had been at war with Torrio's organization for months. Al took the note straight to Johnny Torrio's office above the saloon on South Wabash. Torrio read it twice, his face growing darker with each word. "It's a setup, Al," Torrio said finally. "They take Frank to draw you in, then they kill you both." Al nodded. He knew it was a trap. Anyone with half a brain could see that. "So what do we do?" Al asked. "We wait, we plan, we hit them where they live, not where they want us to come." "And Frank?" Torrio's silence was answer enough. Al stared at his boss for a long moment, understanding what wasn't being said. Frank was already dead, or would be soon. The smart play was to cut losses and plan revenge. The business play was to avoid walking into an obvious trap. The brother play was something else entirely. "No," Al said quietly. "No what? I'm not leaving Frank in there." Torrio leaned back in his chair. "Al, think about this. You walk into that warehouse. You're not coming out. Then I've lost 2 good men instead of 1. Maybe, or maybe I walk out with my brother. How? Even if Frank is alive, even if you could somehow get him out, you think they're just going to let you walk away?" Al was quiet for a moment, thinking about the layout of the neighborhood around Carpenter Street. The warehouse district where sounds carried but people didn't ask questions. The network of alleys and loading docks that could provide cover or trap you depending on how you used them. "I have an idea," Al said finally. Torrio shook his head. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth it. Frank is my brother, Johnny. He's the only family I have in this city. If I don't try to get him out—" Al paused, choosing his words carefully. "If I don't try, I'm not the man you brought to Chicago, and I'm not the man my mother raised." There was something in Al's voice that Torrio had never heard before. Not just determination, but a kind of cold clarity that came from having made a decision that no amount of arguing could change. "You'll go in alone," Torrio said. "It wasn't a question. That's what they want. That's what the note says. And you think you can bluff your way out." Al looked at his boss, this man who had taught him everything about running a criminal organization, about calculating risks and managing violence. "Johnny, I'm 24 years old. I'm strong enough to fight 10 men and stupid enough to try. And I love my brother more than I'm afraid of dying. He stood up, straightening his jacket. Sometimes that's enough. Al spent the rest of that day preparing for something he had never done before, walking knowingly into a trap. He started by visiting his apartment on South Prairie, where he kept a small arsenal of weapons acquired over his years working for Torrio. Two .38 revolvers, fully loaded, a .45 automatic with 2 extra clips, a sawed-off shotgun that could clear a room in seconds. But as Al loaded the weapons and tucked them into various pockets and holsters, he realized that firepower wasn't going to save him. The Jenna brothers weren't amateurs. If they had Frank, they had planned for Al to come armed and desperate. What they hadn't planned for was Al thinking like a businessman instead of a gunfighter. Al's real weapon wasn't going to be the guns he carried. It was going to be information. He spent the afternoon visiting contacts throughout the South Side, asking quiet questions about the Jenna operation. Who worked for them? Where did they keep their money? What businesses did they run that depended on staying quiet and avoiding attention? What Al discovered was that Angelo Jenna, the oldest brother and the leader of their organization, had a secret that he was desperately trying to keep hidden. He was stealing from his own operation, skimming money that should have been going to his younger brothers and his soldiers. It was the kind of secret that could destroy an organization from the inside if the wrong people found out about it. Al smiled grimly as he tucked this information away. He was starting to see a path through this trap. Not around it, but through it. As evening approached, Al made one final stop, a telephone booth outside a drugstore on Halsted Street. He placed a call to a number he had memorized weeks earlier but never used. Chicago Police Detective Bureau. I need to speak to Detective Morrison. Who's calling? Al paused for just a moment. What he was about to do would change everything about how he operated in Chicago. But Frank was worth it. Tell him it's Al Capone. Tell him I have information about a murder that's going to happen tonight. At 11:30 p.m., Al Capone began walking down Carpenter Street toward the warehouse where his brother was being held. The street was eerily quiet, too quiet. Every legitimate business in the area had closed hours earlier, leaving only the kinds of operations that preferred to work in darkness. The warehouse stood at the end of the block, a 3-story brick building that had once housed a furniture factory, but now served as a front for whatever illegal activities needed space and privacy. Light spilled from a few second-floor windows, but the street level was dark except for a single bulb over the main entrance, perfect for an ambush. Al walked slowly, his hands visible but never far from the weapons concealed under his coat. He had no illusions about what he was walking into. The Jenna brothers wanted him dead, and they were professional enough to make sure it happened, but they also wanted to send a message. They wanted other members of the Torrio organization to see what happened to people who challenged them. That meant they would want to talk first, to gloat, to make sure all understood exactly why he was about to die. That talking was going to be Al's opportunity. As he approached the warehouse door, 2 men stepped out of the shadows on either side of the entrance. Both were holding rifles, pointed directly at Al's chest. "You're late, Capone," one of them said. "Traffic," Al replied calmly. "Is my brother inside?" "He's inside. Question is whether he's still alive." Al nodded toward the door. "Let's find out." The 2 men exchanged glances. They had obviously been expecting someone more desperate, more emotional. Instead, they were facing a young man who seemed almost casual about walking into what everyone knew was a death trap. "You're not afraid?" one of them asked. Al considered the question seriously. "Of course I'm afraid. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid. But fear doesn't change anything. My brother is in there, and I'm going to get him out. Or die trying, Al agreed. The interior of the warehouse was exactly what Al had expected. A large, mostly empty space with concrete floors and exposed beams, perfect for the kind of conversation where screaming wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Frank was there, tied to a chair in the center of the room, conscious but clearly beaten. His face was swollen, his shirt torn and bloodied, but his eyes were alert. When he saw Al walk through the door, his expression showed relief mixed with horror. Relief that his brother had come for him, horror that Al had walked into the trap. Surrounding Frank were 6 men, all armed, all watching the entrance where Al now stood with his escort. At the far end of the room, sitting behind a makeshift desk, was Angelo Jenna himself. Angelo was a small man with the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of violence and survival. He looked at Al with the expression of someone examining a particularly interesting insect. "Al Capone," Angelo said, his voice carrying the accent of his Sicilian childhood. "You came. You invited me. I didn't think you were stupid enough to accept." Al shrugged. "Maybe I'm not as smart as people think." Angelo laughed, a sound without humor. "Maybe, or maybe you think you're smarter than you are." Al walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping about 10 feet from his brother. Frank tried to speak, but his mouth was clearly damaged. He settled for catching Al's eye and giving the smallest possible shake of his head. "Don't do anything crazy," Frank's look said. "Too late for that," Al's expression replied. "So here's how this works," Angelo continued. "You and your brother, you've been interfering with my business, taking territory that should be mine, making deals with people who should be working with me. Business is competitive," Al said mildly. "Not anymore, not for you." Angelo stood up from behind his desk, walking closer to where Al stood. "I'm going to kill you both, but first I want to make sure you understand why. I want to make sure Torrio gets the message that this is what happens when you cross the Guinea family." Al nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good plan. Solid business thinking." Angelo's eyes narrowed. "You're taking this very calmly for a man about to die." "Well," Al said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, "I've got some information you might want to hear before you pull that trigger." Every gun in the room swung toward Al as he withdrew his hand from his pocket, but instead of a weapon, he was holding a folded piece of paper. "What's that?" Angelo demanded. "Bank records," Al said simply. "Very interesting bank records." Al unfolded the paper and held it where Angelo could see the numbers written on it. They were real numbers. Al had done his homework that afternoon, but the paper itself was a fake he had prepared in case this moment came. "These are deposits you've been making to a private account," Al said conversationally. "Money that's supposed to be going to your brothers, to your soldiers. Instead, it's been going to Angelo Jenna's personal savings." The room went very quiet. Every man in that warehouse understood the implications of what Al was saying. Stealing from your own organization wasn't just bad business, it was a death sentence if your partners found out. "You're lying," Angelo said, but there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. $43,000, Al continued, reading from his fake document, "skimmed over the past 6 months. That's almost $8,000 per month that should have been split among your people." One of the gunmen, a young Sicilian who clearly worked for one of Angelo's brothers, stepped forward slightly. "Angelo, is this true?" "Of course it's not true," Angelo snapped. "He's lying to try to save his skin." Al folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "Maybe I am lying, but those numbers are pretty specific. And you know what's interesting about bank records? They're very easy to verify." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the gunmen. "How much money have you boys been making lately? Because according to these records, you should be making about 30% more than whatever Angelo's been paying you." The silence that followed was electric. Al could see the wheels turning in each man's mind, calculating their own pay against what Al was suggesting they should have been earning. "Even if that were true," Angelo said, his voice tight, "it doesn't change anything. You're still going to die here tonight." "Oh, I know," Al said easily. "You're absolutely going to kill me. But here's the thing. I already made a copy of these records, and that copy is sitting in a safe deposit box with instructions to be opened and delivered to your brothers if I don't pick it up by tomorrow morning." Angelo's face went pale. "So yes, you can kill me," Al continued. "But 12 hours later, your own organization is going to tear itself apart, and Frank and I will still be just as dead, but you'll be dead too." For a long moment, nobody moved. Angelo stared at Al, clearly trying to figure out if this young man was bluffing or if he really had been smart enough to set up this kind of insurance policy. Al stared back, his face completely calm, as if they were discussing the weather instead of negotiating for their lives. Frank, still tied to his chair but following every word, looked back and forth between his brother and Angelo with the expression of someone watching a deadly poker game where the stakes couldn't be higher. Finally, Angelo spoke. "You're bluffing." "Maybe," Al said. "Want to find out? Even if you really have those records, what makes you think I care? What makes you think I won't just kill you and take my chances with my brothers?" Al smiled for the first time since entering the warehouse. "Because you're a smart businessman, Angelo. And smart businessmen always look for the deal that benefits everyone." "What deal?" "Simple. You let Frank and me walk out of here. In exchange, I give you the original records. And I mean the real original records, not this fake copy I've been waving around." Angelo's eyes widened slightly. "You admit this is fake?" "Of course it's fake. But the information is real. I spent all afternoon gathering it." Al's voice became more serious. "Angelo, you have been skimming from your own operation. Maybe not 43,000. Maybe not 8,000 a month, but you have been taking more than your share." The younger gunman who had spoken earlier took another step forward. "Angelo," and Al continued before Angelo could respond, "your brothers are going to find out eventually. These things always come to light. The question is whether you want them to find out from their enemies during a war, or from their brother during a peaceful conversation where you can explain your reasons." Al looked around the room again. "Gentlemen, I'm offering your boss a chance to clean house before someone else does it for him. That's good for everyone in this room." Angelo Jenna stood in the middle of that warehouse, surrounded by his own men, holding every advantage, and realized that he was trapped just as thoroughly as Al Capone had been when he walked through the door. If he killed Al and Frank, the information about his skimming might still surface. If it did, his own brothers would kill him in a way that would make tonight's planned execution look merciful. If he let them go and Al was lying about having real evidence, he would look weak and foolish. But if he let them go and Al really could provide information that allowed Angelo to get ahead of his problem with his brothers, what exactly are you proposing? Angelo asked finally. Frank and I walk out of here tonight. Tomorrow I deliver the real information I gathered about your finances, all of it including some suggestions about how you might explain the discrepancies to your brothers. In exchange, this war between your family and the Torrio organization ends. We go back to competing like businessmen instead of trying to kill each other like animals. Angelo considered this. And if I say no, then you kill us, and you take your chances with your brothers when they find out what you've been doing. Because Angelo, whether I'm alive or dead, they're going to find out. The only question is whether you get to control how they find out. Frank watched this negotiation with amazement. His little brother, the one he had protected in street fights when they were kids, was calmly talking his way out of certain death by threatening their captor with something more frightening than death: exposure. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Angelo made his decision. Cut him loose, he said, nodding toward Frank. One of his men stepped forward with a knife and began cutting the ropes that held Frank to the chair. Frank stood slowly, testing his weight on legs that had been tied for hours. You have 24 hours, Angelo said to Al. Tomorrow night, same time, you deliver everything you promised. If you don't show up, if what you bring me isn't useful, this whole arrangement disappears and we finish what we started tonight. Understood, Al said. And Capone, yeah? Don't ever threaten me again. Next time, I won't be in such a generous mood. Al helped his brother toward the door, Frank leaning heavily on his arm. As they reached the exit, Al turned back one last time. Angelo? For what it's worth, I think you're a smart businessman who got in over his head. That's not the same thing as being a bad man. There's a way out of this that leaves everyone stronger than they were before. Angelo nodded slightly. It was the closest thing to a truce that either man was going to offer. Al and Frank walked slowly through the dark streets of Chicago's South Side, Frank's arm draped over his brother's shoulders for support, both of them listening for sounds of pursuit that never came. They didn't speak until they were several blocks away from the warehouse, far enough to feel relatively safe from immediate danger. All, Frank said finally, his voice hoarse from the beating he had taken. Yeah, what you did back there, walking into that place alone, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. All thought about it. Probably both. Did you really have bank records? Real ones? Some. Enough to know that Angelo has been playing games with his books. Not enough to prove it in any kind of court, but enough to make his brothers ask uncomfortable questions. Frank nodded slowly. And the safe deposit box, the insurance policy. All grinned in the darkness. There is no safe deposit box. That was complete bull. Frank stopped walking and stared at his brother. You bluffed your way out of there. You bluffed our way out of there. I told you, Frank, sometimes being young and stupid is enough. They resumed walking, both of them thinking about what had just happened and what it meant for their future in Chicago. All, Frank said as they approached the streetcar stop that would take them home. What? Thank you, for coming for me, for risking everything. All looked at his older brother, this man who had always been his protector, his guide, his example of what it meant to be strong. Frank, you're my brother. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I hadn't tried, even if it meant getting yourself killed. All considered the question seriously. What's the point of living if you can't protect the people you love? It was a philosophy that would guide Al Capone for the rest of his life, through all the violence and success and ultimate downfall that lay ahead. The belief that family comes first, that loyalty matters more than safety, that some things are worth any risk. On that October night in 1923, walking through the dark streets with his beaten but alive brother, Al Capone learned something about himself that would shape everything he became, that when the people he loved were in danger, he was capable of anything, even walking into a death trap, even bluffing his way out again, even believing that courage and cleverness could overcome any odds. He was 24 years old, and the world seemed full of possibilities. The story of the night Al Capone walked into a death trap to save his brother has been told and retold for 100 years, growing in the telling as all good stories do. But at its heart, it's not really a story about gangsters or violence or the dangerous streets of Prohibition-era Chicago. It's a story about brotherhood, about the kind of love that makes rational people do irrational things, about the moment when a young man discovers that he's willing to risk everything for someone else. Every generation has these moments. Every generation produces young men and women who walk into their own versions of death traps because someone they love needs them to. They volunteer for dangerous military missions because their buddies are in trouble. They stand up to bullies twice their size because their friends need protection. They take risks that seem insane to anyone watching from a safe distance. What Al Capone had that night was what every young person has and every older person remembers: the absolute conviction that love is stronger than fear, that loyalty matters more than safety, that there are things worth dying for even when you have everything to live for. Those of us who have lived long enough to see our hair turn gray sometimes forget how fearless we once were, how ready we were to throw ourselves into impossible situations for the people we cared about. We call it foolishness now, and maybe it was, but it was also beautiful in its own way. That willingness to believe that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Al Capone's walk down Carpenter Street that night was the walk that every young person takes when they decide that protecting someone else matters more than protecting themselves. Some find that courage on battlefields. Others find it in hospital rooms, sitting with sick friends through endless nights. Still others find it in small moments of everyday heroism that never make headlines but change lives nonetheless. The form doesn't matter. What matters is the willingness to take the walk when it's your turn to take it. Frank Capone recovered from that beating and lived for many more years. He and Al remained close until Frank's death in 1924, less than a year later, in a shootout with police during a political dispute in Cicero. But for those months in between, Frank never forgot what his younger brother had risked for him. And Al never forgot the lesson he learned that night: that the most dangerous thing you can do is sometimes the only thing worth doing. It's a lesson worth remembering, no matter what generation you belong to, because sooner or later, we all face our own version of that walk down a dark street toward an uncertain outcome. And when that moment comes, the only question that matters is whether we have the courage to keep walking,